Okay, good evening everyone, and thank you for joining us for the second UDG event on the Draft National Model Design Code. I'm Katja Stille, Chair of the Urban Design Group, and I will be joined today by 7 leading speakers from different specialisms. Our first event a couple of weeks ago was more of a conversation with the audience. We heard many different views and together explored a range of issues, such as the code and local distinctiveness, codes versus guidance and how these relate to scale, the practicalities of codes, and how a code could be made accessible to the community. So many of you might have been at that session, but if you've missed it, a recording of it is available on our website. Today is slightly different. We have a packed schedule. We have 7 speakers, 7 short and sharp talks. And currently, and I appreciate that you all have chosen to join us today because there are a lot of events that explore the National Model Design Code. There are events by the RTPI, by the RIBA, by the CIHT, and many others. But we believe urban design stretches across many different professional bodies and backgrounds, and our membership is very diverse. Therefore, we felt it is important to bring a lot of different voices together in a single space. I mean, you might have heard me talking about the need to break down professional silos and to collaborate. And I think today is an opportunity to do this. We have a range of speakers giving us views from different perspectives, including highway and transport, planning, property, water management, trees and the environment, skills, resources, as well as a view from the community. So it will be a full evening and hopefully we will have time for questions and answers at the end. So please put your questions into the chat and we will pick them up as we have finished the presentations. So before we start with the speakers, please remember the usual housekeeping. The session is being recorded and please stay on mute and post your questions in the chat. So we start off with Phil Jones, who will give us the movement and transport perspectives. And I don't think Phil needs much of an introduction. You will all know him and his influential work. For many years, he has worked and campaigned tirelessly to bring together highway and urban design with the aim of creating places that meet the needs of people first and transport second. So we look forward to hearing Phil's view on the National Model Design Code. Over to you, Phil.
Great, thank you very much, Katja. Pleasure to be here. Firstly to say, this is a personal view, and even though the consultation on this closes at 11:45 p.m, so on the dot, on the 27th of March, I still need to kind of work through the detail myself. But this is my take on an overview of the document, and just sort of putting that into context. So I wanted just to first point, I think, is that there's a really close relationship between the National Design Code that we've had for some time and the new National Draft Model Design Code and Manual for Streets 1 and 2, which I'm very pleased to see are key references in both documents. So actually come ahead of other documents, but there are lots of documents that are referred to in the National Design Guide. I think what we're finding here is we're putting back design guidance and sort of replanting the scorched earth that we had when documents like by design were taken out. When we had a national design guidance document with no pictures in it, which is unbelievable, really. So it's quite terrific that Manual for Streets is up there, and I think it's good that government is recognising that design matters and that streets are central to good design. So one of the things I did was just have a look at the mentions of the word street in the National Design Guide to begin with, and we've got 76 in there, and that comes ahead of parking and walk or walking and cycle or cycling and public transport. And then when we come to the Model Design Code, we're up to a whopping 255 mentions of the word street, and I've actually took out the 256th, which is the address of M8CLG. So it's clearly streets are central. It's all about the streets, which is great to see. So just going back to where we were with the National Design Guide on movement, I mean, I think there's some good stuff in here. connections to destinations within the site and beyond its boundaries, clear pattern of streets, but it's all rather wordy, and I think that's perhaps one of the charges that have been levelled at the National Design Guide. And I think the Model Design Code is putting a bit of meat and a bit of certainty behind that. So we've got the Model Design Code and we've got the guidance notes where we look at for some key information. Obviously, it's still fairly high level. And when it comes to streets, the guidance notes and the Model Design Code refer to Manual for Streets, and we know that we are going to get a new Manual for Streets, which is going to bring together Manual for Streets 1 and 2 later this year or perhaps early next year. And the two are kind of informing each other. So the thoughts in here about typologies and how it all fits together, I'm sure will be reflected. And I'm on the project board for that. I'm not involved in the writing of it this time, but I'm on the project board and been having conversations with the WSP led team with Andy Cameron and others, ITP, that are producing it. And I know they're watching very carefully how this all comes down. So it's words like detailed guidance and specific detailed parameters that I think give me a bit of confidence that we're kind of getting somewhere, because one of the charges against the original Manual for Streets is that it didn't quite hit the spot. I mean, I think there was some good stuff in it, I would say that, wouldn't I? And I think, you know, it did move things on, but it didn't quite have the impact that it should have done. I remember it was Tim, many of you will know Tim was part of the drafting team, and I remember him quite distinctly saying we should have as few numbers as possible. When we give people numbers, it just stops them thinking. Let's take it away and make engineers think. But of course, you know, the culture of engineers is pass fail, and understandably so, because they are held liable so often. So, you know, engineers do need some certainty. And I remember getting very cross with a high authority DC officer who said, can't work to Manual for Streets, it's too fluffy. But I came away thinking, well, you know, she has a point actually. And if it's not working for her, then it's not working. So I think, you know, this is a chance for a bit of a reset. Manual for Streets said a lot about hierarchies and this idea of a dual hierarchy of movements in place. And when I first read or saw that diagram in the Model Design Code, street hierarchy, it was purely about movement. I thought, oh gosh, are we sort of going backwards here? And it talked about the hierarchy following those movement strategies. And you know, we seem to have lost this diagram that was in Manual for Streets and Manual for Streets 2, that was led by the work of Peter Jones, that talked about place status alongside movement status as giving this sort of dual hierarchy to streets. But actually, I think the way it's been handled, I think it still works, because there are some good words in here. Different streets play different roles depending on movements, but then it talks about built form and the uses around the design of the street space itself. And street types include multifunctional streets, all have different place and movement functions. So I think the idea of streets having place and movement functions is in there. We just don't see it in this sort of two-dimensional hierarchy. And I know there are some big people like Colin Davis who've argued passionately that you can't put place on a graph like this, and it doesn't work. Place is too complicated, too nebulous to be put on that simple linear scale. So maybe there's something in that. And so what we actually get all of those kind of place functions of streets are talked about in the public space section, not in the movement section. And you know, I looked at that and I thought, actually that kind of works, and that's where it's in the public space where you find the more detail about how we design these kind of linear spaces, I suppose, that we can think of them as. Connectivity, I like the things that he talked about connectivity, and I like this simple rule, which I hope will work when developers test it. Each street has more than one connection to another street, and I think that's pretty good, really. And it talks about street types and within the typology, and says we should only have cul-de-sac at the tertiary level of street type. So that's kind of interesting. And I also like what he says about filtering. Filtered permeability. This image is from Waltham Forest, which has been held up as a sort of a really good exemplar of filtered permeability within a grid network. And it's positive about that. And he talks about permeability for different users can be controlled. by measures within the street space to prevent through movement. So I like that. I think when Manufactured Streets came out, I know there were many active travel campaigners who think it's too pro-permeability for motor traffic, and maybe this is redressing the balance of that. So we can have connectivity for all modes, but more connectivity for the most benign modes, the most sustainable modes, and that's a really interesting development. You know, to get away from this is so much pod development with private drives that prevent actually design out connectivity and create these sort of executive homes where people who live there suggest they prize the fact that nobody else can walk past their house. What Sue McGlynn called kinetophobia, the fear of movement. So hopefully it gets away from this. But will it get away from this? This is the other problem of connectivity, which is driven by land boundaries. So here, you know, we have a site, okay, it's not particularly well connected internally, but it's extremely poorly connected externally, one way in and one way out, and it's another skin of the onion surrounded by cul-de-sacs. You know, if we're going to drive connectivity beyond the site boundary, then that's going to take some really robust policy or decisions by planning authorities, because that's often constrained by land ownership. And you know, our planning authority is really going to refuse consent when there is not more than one means of access to a site, and you know, that's going to be very interesting to see. Is it going to challenge that? I think public transport, I mean, there's some good words in here about public transport key to providing people with choice and everyday journeys. And says a site or location has good public transport accessibility when willing to have a public transport stop within walking distance. And I thought about that. I thought, actually, I'm not sure that's enough. You know, that you could achieve that if your public transport stop had one bus a week. So I think, you know, I question some of the stuff that's in here about public transport. And there are other good references that we could refer to. So again, the work of Tim Farrow with CIHD, some really good practical guidance to how we plan and design for buses and what good public transport access looks like. And I think there's some references there. So I think that little bit of the National Model Design Code probably needs a bit of beefing up. But active travel is dealt with very well. And I mean, it's interesting that it's within the guidance, it's actually a tier above public transport. It's raised up to the level of connectivity, and perhaps, you know, that's interesting and shows the importance of that for health and well-being. And just some little details that I don't know if you can see, but just the fact we've got things like continuous footways in the diagram, just, you know, slipping in there. I think that's really nice. Again, this is Orphan Forest. It's good to see local low traffic neighbourhoods cited. They are supported in Local Transport Note 120, this has just come out, and Gear Change, the government's cycling and walking plan, very positive about low traffic neighbourhoods. So it's good to see that in the National Model Design Code, but it says maybe appropriate only where supported by the local community. So that's a bit weak-willed. Is that a kind of reaction to some of the negative press, unnecessarily negative press, I think, that we've seen around low traffic neighbours? And when we say that, you know, what community, if this is new build, what community can we ask about that? So I think we could be a little bit stronger, because Active Travel England is going to be a player here. It's not mentioned, you know, probably quite rightly, but for those of you who are not aware, Department of Transport is working now to work out what Active Travel England is going to do, but one of its functions will be a statutory consultee within the planning system, so we'll have something to say about that. And then so streets and places, we find that in the public space section of the design code. So here we talk about different types of street and public space, referring back to the hierarchy. So that's all good, and we see different typologies of streets. These are exemplars, and they may not be exhaustive, and then where we might see them, and that's all going to come in the codes. That's great. And they talk about the dual functions of movement and place. So as I say, it's in there. It's just not kind of represented in quite the same way as Manual for Streets. And then we get the typologies, and I like that. And I mean, there's some details I need to look at. Are they right? It'll be interesting to see how when Money for Streets takes this forward, even though there might need to be a bit of iteration here coming back. And I like the little pop-ups that work in the PDFs that tell you a bit more about it, and we get these isometrics that show the relationship between the buildings and the movement on the streets and how that all works. So I think they're very good. And I mean, it's interesting. We've been doing some work recently for Homes England as a kind of stopgap, possibly before Money for Streets comes along, and that we're going to talk about this at their design day in April. Where again, we talk about typologies, and here we just, in the context of big urban extensions, principal main streets, secondary street, tertiary streets, and then these edge lanes and private driveways, of what might we see, what features might we see, and categorizing them with place, movement, access, parking, drainage, which are the street functions in Manual for Streets. So there's some kind of link up there with the thinking that we've been doing, which is good. And then, you know, the images about what green looks like for those different typologies. So that this all seems to be going in the same direction. And then, of course, we're saying this intention that all new streets are going to include trees. I mean, that seems to me to be a little simplistic, and I'd be interested what others think about that. It's obviously, trees are great, we all love trees, but is it right that every street should have trees in it? I don't know, but it is in there, and you know, at the moment, very few new streets have trees. And when they do go at planning stage, they tend to disappear. Amy Burbage of Homes England has done a great presentation about the disappearing trees between planning and implementation. So even if we get some street trees in, that's great. So that's my final slide. So I think the guidance is good, it's well structured. I think it builds on and reflects Money for Streets principles. It's got a slightly different take on how movement and place is talked about, but I think it works. I think public transport needs a bit more detail, but I think active travel is handled well. I'm sure others will have detailed comments, but for me, I think it's a good document, and I wish it well. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was a very good overview, very positive view, and encouraging view, which is great to hear. So next up is, we are hearing the planning perspective, which is provided by Helen Flage. Helen is a planner and urban designer and has extensive experience of working with and for local authorities. Helen was a planning and design quality lead at Homes England and has therefore substantial knowledge of planning and delivering large-scale and complex development. Currently, she's Principal Strategic Planning Officer at North Hertfordshire District Council. Helen, over to you.
I just unmuted myself. Yes, so my presentation looks at securing quality through the planning system and how the National Model Design Code sort of fits into that. And that's the current planning system we have, not the one that's suggested in the planning white paper. So to me, good design is a key aspect of sustainable development and is indivisible from good planning. This well-known line from planning guidance over many years has now been lost, which I think is a real shame, as it decouples that important link. The focus now seems to be on the appearance and aesthetic value of design rather than sustainable function. Oops, it's just stuck. It's frozen.
Maybe you want to go out of screen share and back in again?
Oh no, it's okay now. It's just having a little think. So design guides and codes are no silver bullet for securing place and design quality. And until we start planning strategically and within a sustainable development-led approach, working towards zero carbon, we'll continue to build the wrong developments in the wrong place. So there's obviously something wrong when the planning system gives us this, and it also gives us this. So whilst it's unacceptable to have such poorly designed developments, a lot of these developments also have very poor or no green infrastructure and have led to more loss of nature and a negative environmental impact. So there's been a policy failure to deliver design quality. And for me, one of the key failings is the inability to plan and design in a green setting. So it's interesting to look at this really, because what do the statutory and policy requirements actually require planners to do? Well, we're only actually required in our local plans to identify allocations on a proposals map with a red edge, what I call the blob. And our system also, in terms of the development management order, only requires a red line to be submitted for outline planning applications with an indication of where access is going to be taken, if that's a reserve matter. And then a design and access statement that in the worst cases just describes a poor layout with lots of illustrative material. So how do we planners try and secure design quality through the planning system? Well, to address those failings, lots of planning authorities try and go above and beyond to try and secure quality. And a key tool for authorities is the master plan. So the master plan is the most common design tool used by local authorities. And a master plan is the spatial interpretation of a vision. But it's not produced in one stage, it's produced in a staged or cascade approach, which is undertaken aligned to the planning and delivery process and the technical and viability evidence. So it fixes increasing detailed amounts of spatial and design instruction at each stage. Just to quickly look at those stages. So area framework plans are produced as part of a local plan, and these set out high-level structuring and organising principles for an area or a site in a spatial diagram, which is based on a proportionate evidence base. And this is an example from a local plan, the Plymouth local plan around Derriford. So this framework plan is providing the same in relation to a commercial district centre that requires major redevelopment. So it's setting a framework, not a code, a framework to guide further design development when technical information and market conditions allow. So this is a framework plan for a new garden community. This is a framework plan to support a strategic site allocation in a local plan. And this is a framework plan to support a master plan SPD. So we do design, we do plan in local plans. It's not just all about words. We do try our best to get, area-wide and site-specific plans in place to give clear instruction on design issues. So in terms of sort of outline planning applications, if a development requires an EIA, then parameter plans need to be produced to enable the environmental impact to be assessed and mitigated. So parameter plans can, at the local authority's discretion, also be used to fix design matters, but legislation doesn't require this. So in terms of design codes, they're frequently used at the moment in practice, usually for large sites, more than 500 units, either site-wide, as this well-known design code at Upton shows, with a regulating plan and clear design instruction, or for very large sites, they're produced on a phased basis. And they can only be implemented if a detailed master plan has been produced that provides the spatial vision accompanied by a regulating plan. So that's the plan on the right here. And they're most commonly produced at the moment as a pre-commencement condition on an outline permission, but they can also be adopted as supplementary planning documents. But importantly, they are produced close to the point of delivery when there's sufficient market and technical information available. And finally, reserve matters. So in terms of the steps that the government could take to better embed place and design quality in the planning system, it could require local planning authorities to produce area and site-specific master plan frameworks in their local plans that would then receive full policy weight and they could also change the development management order back to how it used to function in 2006 with a set of parameter plans to fix design quality. And these would be needed to validate outline planning applications, together with a complete rehaul of the design and access statement system. So they actually fix design, instruction and intent. So how does the National Model Design Code change things? Well, it's not introducing anything particularly new. It's based on lots of previous guidance that's been produced in the past. It's obviously been updated. In terms of implementing such area and site-wide codes, NPPF, as to be amended, requires local planning authorities to prepare design codes or guides, and these should be produced as part of the plan or as a supplementary planning document. So importantly, NPPF isn't going to say local authorities have to produce codes. They can just produce a guide. And that's an important point. So in terms of how do we actually embed these guides and codes within the current system, don't worry, I'm not going to read through this table. My view is that it would be challenging to integrate a design guide or code into a local plan. I'm not convinced it would easily pass the soundness tests with its focus on viability and delivery, a need to produce a robust evidence base, and for policies to be written in a clear and unambiguous way. It would be possible to set out in strategic policies in a local plan where master plans and design codes should be produced on an area-wide or site-specific basis, and that currently happens in practice anyway. So adopting a design guide or a code as a supplementary planning document is the most sensible route to ensuring it receives sufficient weight in the decision-making process as a material consideration, but you'll need a policy hook to be able to do this. So requiring better design documentation to support planning applications is possible at the moment at the local authority's discretion, and local planning authorities can obviously attach requirement for a site-specific design code as a condition. So some final observations that I have on the National Model Design Code are firstly related to terminology. There's a new definition of a design code in the guidance that differs from the definition in the National Design Guide and NPPF. And this new definition seems to decouple the design code from a master plan. Design guides and codes are used together throughout the document, but they're very different things, and a code needs a regulating plan and a guide does not. Parameter plans are used a bit out of context, which could be misleading. And I think there's an underestimation of the analysis required to accurately fix design instruction, especially for large sites. So this table and these plans set out sort of typical information that you need really to be able to fix sort of design, decision-making and instruction, particularly for larger sites. So I think there's a bit of an oversimplification of the master planning and coding process for larger sites. And there's a lack of reference as well to other planning and environmental legislation that design decisions can impact on, and how this would be taken account of in the coding process. So the area types that are set out feel a slight oversimplification of reality. I think many areas straddle these zones and need comprehensive redevelopment, and coding them would be a superficial exercise without the evidence and master planning and market realism required. So there's a risk of coding, I think, leading to a traditional approach as well, that might not necessarily embrace working towards zero carbon and using environmental technologies. So finally, from a sort of planning perspective, a town and country planning perspective, I find the guide a little bit too urban design led, which you might not want to hear. And I'm not convinced that the street, the block and the public square should be the primary organising components for new places, especially on greenfield sites. And I don't think this has worked. So I think we need a more landscape-led approach that prioritises spaces and routes for people and nature, and that green infrastructure is used as a key structuring element in how we plan and design, rather than a second thought. This will help restore nature, mitigate and adapt to climate change, and restore public life, reconnecting people to each other and also with our environment. So that's the end of my presentation.
Thank you very much, Helen. I like your call for more integration of landscape and the environment. I think we've all experienced how important it is in the last year. I think another point you made kind of leads us really nicely onto Tony, and that's market realism. And I mean, I would have to go back to the code about how much it actually says about having that evidence base of what's deliverable and what's achievable. But maybe somebody else knows more about what the code actually says on that subject. But first of all, over to Tony. And Tony is from RICS, and as our other speakers, he's working across professional boundaries as chartered surveyor and town planner. He has worked in a wide range of areas of planning and property, and both in public and private sectors. He is promoting better understanding of development economics within the planning system and a more integrated place-making approach within the sector. So Tony, over to you.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for inviting us to participate in this event. It's great to have the opportunity, virtual and all as it is, to meet up with people to talk about these kinds of issues. I have chosen the title, The Value of Design, because I think it is important that we understand design in its broadest sense, but also in its narrow sense. That is the value of design. So I'm going to talk about it in its narrow sense, the financial value of design. Next slide, please. There will be some people in the audience who, the one before that, I think, yeah, who may remember this statement. Urban design needs to be inclusive rather than exclusive of sponsors and users' interests and concerns. It needs to use language that sponsors and users understand. I mean the language of money and the marketplace. We need to promote the idea that quality sells. And, you know, people of a certain age will remember John Gummer. And they'll also recall, as was mentioned earlier, that design and planning, design seems to come into planning and disappear from planning at various stages. There was a point when there were many appeal decisions taken where they said it's not the job of the planner to take decisions on design. And here we are full circle where Pillar 3 of the planning reform white paper is almost exclusively about building beautiful places, which is about design. Next slide, please. In the next slide, I'm seizing here on the last two words of John Gummer's statement, which is quality sells. This is very important in all kinds of ways. And those of you familiar with these exemplar developments will be able to recognize these straight off. Upton, Northamptonshire was referred to already. Hampton in Peterborough is there, the middle one. And on the right, you've got Kings Hill in Kent. And down at the bottom, you've got Accordia, Cambridge. And on the right, you've got MulHall, Harlow. Now, this is the result of a piece of work we did to try and identify the link between creating great places and enhancing financial value. And of course, we did conclude that if you develop good places and if you create them to exemplar standards, you will achieve higher values. Now, that's a very important thing to understand in terms of incentivizing a largely private developer market to actually do this kind of work and to build to these standards. So when Helen showed those two slides of really good quality looking developments, contrasted with really poor quality developments coming out of the planning system, you began to wonder, well, what has been the shortcoming here? Because it's the same planning system. So is it an implementation problem? Is it an enforcement problem? Is it a skills problem? But these are all very valid questions to ask. You will also note in this slide that the top three images are of very traditional type housing. The bottom two are from a different sort of menu of design options. In fact, the one on the left is an RIBA award-winning scheme, and the one on the right is an RIBA proposed scheme in MulHall in Harlow. So all of these schemes have been based on design and development, based on design codes or design policies or design guides, however we describe these. And, you know, we're already in some kind of debate about what the terminology for these is and what their status is within the planning system. Next slide, please. So we now begin to sort of ask the question about, you know, what's the outcome of these? We do have a lot of process built into our systems, but the question is, what's the outcome and what are we trying to achieve? And that question that I'm raising and that was already raised about how do we have such varying results coming out of the same system? And so my kind of aspiration for this is that we would lift the average standard of development. So, and I attribute this, I term this as creating good normative architecture. Now, in the architecture profession, normative architecture is pretty dull stuff, mainly. So that should be an aspiration, probably is a bit weak. Nevertheless, if we succeeded in providing everybody with really well-designed places, then in the form which is, and I'll use the term again, normative, but what does it mean? Is it what the planner thinks is normative? What the banker thinks is normative? What the developer thinks, or the purchaser? And these are very important. And I'll pick out the banker for a start, because if you go back to Accordi at Cambridge, I remember having a chat with the developer of the period who said that at some point in the negotiations for the banking loans, the bank said, "You must be crazy. Nobody would ever buy anything like that. How would you be, you know, building houses without gardens? That's radically different than anybody would ever imagine would be able to sell." Now, the result of that is that the bankers skimmed 15% of the gross development value to reduce their risk. So you can see how this is straight away connected into how we fund development. And that's very important. And I'll show you a slide at the end, which will emphasize the importance of that. Now, that banker would have been advised by a development surveyor like me, who would say, "I've turned up there. I've never seen a house without a garden. And if we're going to promote houses, they need to have gardens." What I'm talking about here is whether or not these design codes that we are going to be producing, whether they are based on inflexible ideas about what living is. And there's hardly anybody at the moment who thinks that without innovation in how we design and build, we cannot address climate change. So there are very interesting tensions between the idea of having greater certainty to assure people of what is going to be built. And that's a big part of the planning system at the moment. And I have to say, in our submissions to government, we have advocated greater certainty, because, you know, there is a sense in communities that they make a plan over a 15-year period and they still have no idea what's going to turn up. And likewise for developers who work with the planning system, they're unclear about what is required. So a move to more certainty is probably a good step. Nevertheless, if it means that we paralyze everything in order to be certain, that is a problem in my view. Which takes us into tricky territory like taste, which is personal. and style, which is, you know, it could be from a particular period, or a particular period where an architectural orthodoxy applied. When I studied planning many years ago, it was still, the modern movement was still in full spate. And in fact, when I worked as a planner, postmodernism was all the rage, and it was great because architects designed buildings that actually were like Georgian buildings in Dublin that I was very familiar with. And so we go through all of these styles and tastes, but what we really are down to is design, quality design, and I'm saying it transcends these personal tastes and styles. Now, that judgment about design has typically been an architectural judgment, but you find that in the current scheme of policy, architects have been kind of pushed to one side. And I wonder who then is going to be the arbiter in this case. Next slide, please. I put this up partly in a mood of lightness, but also because it's a personal experience. And I'm presenting it here as the alternative agent's details. It's a very desirable residence in a sought-after location. And it's a 3-bedroom terraced house, 120 square meters over 3 floors, so it's pretty decent size. It's a waterfront setting. But here it begins to sort of fall apart a bit. Access through a supermarket car park. It's not a great selling point, is it? If it looks like a bit of a caravan on end, well, you wouldn't go for that either. And it's got a warehouse type sliding door on one side and corrugated metal sheeting on the other. Now, here's the interesting thing. I got an instruction from a bank to value this property many years ago. So you can imagine when I turned up and saw this, it wasn't the first time I saw it. I live in the area, actually. It was not surprising at all when I saw it. But I said to myself, my God, how am I going to value this? How am I going to place a value on this? Next slide, please. This is what I was being asked to value, one of these dwellings. Some of you who know your architectural history will recognize it as a piece of work by Nicholas Grimshaw. It's part of high-tech modernism, very well designed, in a particular style. Well, what's the market for this? And that's a very critical thing when you are dealing with design. And very often we as surveyors are criticized by architects because they say to us, you don't value our architecture. And my response is quite straightforward. You're absolutely right. We don't value your architecture. We assess what the market is prepared to pay for buildings which have architectural qualities associated with it. That's quite a different thing. It's not an architectural criticism we are doing. We are assessing whether or not in the market there is a demand for such a building. And the question that we have to satisfy ourselves, because the bank will sue us if we say, listen, there's a market for this at 700,000 and the borrower decides they can't pay any more and they sell it into the market at 500,000 because we've misunderstood whether or not there's demand for such a building at the price point of 700,000. These are very important considerations to take into account. Now, there may be a market at 700,000, but it might be very thin. Or if there is a recession, some of these buildings with unique character don't hold their value as well as the average. So this is where I come back to good normative architecture. And these are all very important things to consider when it comes to the interrelationship between Pillar 2 in the planning reform and Pillar 3, which deals with developer contributions and viability. That's not to say, next slide please, that this building here, which mightn't be to everybody's taste externally, doesn't provide amazingly good quality accommodation internally. And those design guides that we're talking about at the moment don't seem to say very much about the internal qualities of the spaces. And so in a sense, we might be getting to a point where we're talking about exterior decoration rather than design in its fullest sense. I'm going to finish off with something, next slide please, which you might be familiar with value engineering in the context of reducing costs. But here's value engineering in terms of increasing value. And this is not a trite question I'm going to raise, but the building on the left, this is Battersea Power Station. The building on the left is a design by Norman Foster's office. The building on the right is a design by Frank Gehry's office. Now the question, and this is not a trite question I've said, is would you pay more to be in Norman Foster's building looking out on Frank Gehry's, or would you prefer to be in Frank Gehry's looking out at Norman Foster's? Now, why is this significant? It's significant because the gross development value depends on these numbers. And the gross development value is critical to deciding whether or not there's affordable housing available in your viability assessment. So this development as we're looking at it now, I'm not sure where that fits into this design guide coding. And this is a regular sort of London development, and many urban areas in the UK will have sites which would respond to these kinds of designs. And final slide. This is a survey which was taken in 2006. At the time, some of the case studies we did had been initiated, so we wanted to get a sense of what was in the public's mind, what was in the buyer's mind at the time they were thinking of buying those houses in those developments that we studied. But here's an interesting piece of research, and if there's anybody out there with a little bit of money who wants to have this research done, that would be really great. If we could have our current version of what this means, what is the residents' perception of what are the important factors in terms of housing and design, and if we look down at distinctive character, it's the second last on the list. So distinctive character doesn't really feature highly. And in fact, we have to go halfway down the slide to get appearance as coming into play. Now, it will be very interesting to see where the private garden and outside space has moved in the light of our experience up to now. I have nothing left to say other than thank you for listening. It's a very interesting area, and we're very interested in how this interfaces with market behaviors and how design can be used by developers and how they can be encouraged to create great places, design them well, and get the benefits both for their customers and for themselves, and deliver better places for us to live in. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I mean, I think that was a really interesting and valuable kind of presentation, and I think it highlights that it is, well, there is another dimension to it again, which is possibly a little bit ignored in the current kind of discussion about the National Model Design Code. And it is the market, it is what people buy. And I mean, looking at your last chart, it is location. And I've seen a couple of people on the chat saying, well, as long as we have a housing crisis, we might never actually get out of the situation which we find ourselves in. And I think a very interesting point you made also is a criticism that is often targeted at codes in a very difficult conundrum, this certainty versus flexibility. And how do you kind of set the right level of prescriptiveness, leaving the room for innovation for the people who get it right, but controlling the quality for maybe the developers or the architects that don't get it right. I think that's a question maybe for later for the Q&A. So now over to the next. Our next speaker is Illman, and she will talk about water management. Sue is a past president of the Landscape Institute, and I'm sure you will know her. She is also a practicing landscape architect and an advocate for sustainable drainage systems as a key element within the design of our places. Her key ambition is to bring about a meaningful relationship between people and the environment. So going back to Helen's point as well, and today she might tell us how design codes help or hinder delivering that ambition. Over to you, Sue.
Thanks very much indeed, and I'm very pleased to be here this evening. It's like panic because I'd completely forgotten about it. Right, so as a landscape architect and working with SuDS, probably just taking more of a different view about SuDS integration. And with this sort of audience, I don't need to remind you what SuDS are all about. Sustainable drainage systems, a sequence of planted and constructed features designed to slow down rainwater runoff by mimicking natural drainage. But not only that, the whole issue of water, whether it's too much or not enough, is really seen as one of the most critical factors affecting us, particularly by the Committee for Climate Change. So I think my starting point is I don't think the issue of water management has been addressed sufficiently in the new model design codes, and the importance of that statement in terms of climate change, health and well-being, nature, all of these things that have become so important to us. And we see continually this yo-yoing between flooding and droughts, and then the consequent problems that, you know, in terms of health and well-being that we've seen over the last year. This is one way that we can start to rectify some of those things through what we do on a day-to-day basis in terms of our design. So having gone through this to just see where we sit, it's interesting that SuDS come into the document under nature, which I thought was an interesting place for it to be. And quite surprising, it took me a while to actually find that that's where it was lurking. But when we start to drill down into the documents and actually think about what it is, almost every plan, when you looked at it, showed the water that went through the towns and cities that are used to illustrate this document, because naturally, historically, towns and cities were tended to be built on rivers or by the sea, because the need to have that mode of transport was a really important part of why they were sited there. But the consequence of that, with the way that development has gone, you know, over time, and the changes in the climate, means that these are the areas that are now most vulnerable to flooding. And the more that we develop on our suburbs, the more that we can intensify that problem as well. So the issue of flood risk has to be a major consideration in what we're doing in terms of considering all new development. And that filters down both through the existing, the potential proposed as we add on to that, and how we can actually mitigate it through our major water management measures, but actually, more importantly, through what we do every day on each new site that we're working on. So again, you know, looking at this next one, we're now stuck in the open space provision. And there just seems to be this vision that SuDS is in the main about what you do in a public open space with another bomb crater, otherwise known as a pond. You know, we are just so far away from what the concept of what it was intended to be, to the way that we see it rolled out in most of the housing developments that go through planning at the moment. The answer at the moment is pipe to pond. That's actually just traditional drainage. That's nothing to do with SuDS. Now, there's hope there because, you know, research has been done for DEFRA, looking at how we need to reframe what SuDS are all about. We know what we need to do. We know how we need to change the policies, but we're not there yet with doing it. So I see some hope for that, but we've got to see that roll out through the professions and through that wider understanding and through actually engaging with what it means to actually deliver integrated design. So then when we look at some of these diagrams, well, doesn't feature anywhere at all. Now you could say, no, because that's not what this is all about. We're looking at this bigger picture and it's probably tucked into that open space somewhere, But what about those streets? What about those houses? They've all got downpipes. They've all got hard surfaces. They've all got roads and footpaths. Where's that water going? And it's that what's going to cause the localized flooding that's the bane of people's lives. That everyday low incidence of flooding that is non-selective about the people that it damages, and how additional sites and consequential effects and things that have not been thought through properly, not properly implemented, nobody's noticed, that then cause the problems that we're getting in new build as much as in our existing housing and development areas. So here we go again. We're now back in nature again. And we've actually got a good mention here. So SuDS and urban greening. Yes, of course, those two things can and do go hand in hand, but they don't have to, because if we think about where we should be starting from, we should be avoiding that water going anywhere at all. So the fact that, slightly off-piste, we're going to want to talk about rainwater harvesting, the reuse and management of water. It's a precious resource to use it better. But then what are we doing on our roofs? How are we going to actually save it on each site? And then we can start to talk about how we're going to manage what we haven't dealt with close to where it falls through all those other design interventions that we can and should be using really well, and not these simplistic bomb ponds at the end of a pipe. So we now get to SuDS actually being talked about in some detail within the document. And there's that lovely little diagram, and we've crammed them, not all of them in. Where's my bioretention planters? Can't see those, but we got most of the other things in there. So that shows how not this is an example of how we can actually fit all this stuff in a different way. This is the approach we should be taking in each of these little models that are here, because we actually have to do it on everything all the time, everywhere. It's quite simple. It's about changing mindsets, understanding its potential, understanding how we can use it as part of integrated design, and actually just getting on with it, really. So there we go. We've got these lovely little sections of all these different streets and different types of neighborhoods. Nothing in there. But actually, we can equally produce those examples that show exactly how you can actually integrate it within the streets as just something else that we do. And we can get those trees in there, and they can sit in the SuDS as well. Why not? Ideal. Keeps them away from the buildings, keeps them contained, and has the right function in terms of doing it. And we can take these up to every level of detailed design and density. But we've have to be more creative, and clearly we're going to use the permeable paving and all of these other techniques. But SuDS on the surface is where we need it to be. So, and take it to a whole neighborhood, there you go. And it looks really complex, but it's actually no more complex if you think about a pipe system coming out of a building. It's just doing it in a completely different way. And that's where the need for real good interprofessional understanding from civil engineers, highway engineers, architects, planners, everybody, to actually see what this potential is, because we don't have enough good new build examples in housing schemes to actually get it through from, yes, the really good quality ones who embrace it, to those at the other end of the scale. But if you go to Wales, we're seeing this being rolled out for all new social housing. And if it can be done there, it can be done anywhere. Why not? We just need those exemplars. So yes, we can have lovely retrofit schemes. We need them, we want them. It's making our high streets, and a really important thing, that's, revitalisation of the high streets, making our high streets nicer places to be with good quality urban design, of which SuDS can play a part. And we can take other bigger schemes where, in this instance in Sheffield, things have changed and nobody needs this massive highway anymore, and turning into something that actually delivers infrastructure, transport, cycle routes, places for people to walk to work, taking detours to actually come down here and come and sit here in their lunch hour and actually enjoy being in the urban environment, because all of this is SuDS. But it's green infrastructure, it's linear corridors, it's nature and biodiversity coming together in an intelligent and creative way. Or we can just have the odd urban square and place where actually the SuDS feature is really just an ornamental thing. I'm very sad to say that I can't show you lots of lovely new housing schemes where this has been done really well, because it's really hard to find them. And that, I think, is very sad. And that, for me, is the big challenge for where we go with this whole new concept of how we want to design our places. But we must do it by integrating water management. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue. I think SuDS are really, they are almost the testing case of how well and multidisciplinary that team was that worked on these schemes. Because I think, I mean, maybe other some areas, but I think SuDS is probably the one area where you need the landscape designer, the ecologist, the drainage engineer, absolutely everybody pulling together in the same direction.
Yeah, completely.
Probably more so than many of the other areas. And I think it's a real test whether the team collaborated and worked together and whether they didn't. And one day I dream of a document which actually, you know, has all the different professions working it together, writing it together. But maybe our urban environment is too complex to actually bring it all into one document. But I think, I mean, maybe, and that's probably a question for the audience, is the design code written mostly for planners and designers and not so much for the engineers? Will engineers actually look at this document, and is it relevant for them, and the ecologists? So who's the target audience of this code? And maybe it needs to be widened out. That's a question for everyone else. But we go on, next speaker, sticking to the theme of the kind of environment, trees and environment. And now we have Sue James. And we've heard a lot about the requirement of street trees within the emerging policy. And I think Sue will tell us a little bit more about the practicalities and the benefits. She is a founding member of the Trees Design and Action Group, Trees and Design and Action Groups. And they've undertaken critical work to really increase the awareness of the role of trees in our urban environment. And the group, and with Sue as one of the key voices, really promotes the benefits that trees can bring and seeks to secure those by influencing planning, design, construction, and management. So over to you, Sue.
Thanks very much. And is my screen looking as it should?
It does, yeah.
Thank you. So, time for trees. Gosh, I don't think trees have ever been so high on the agenda, but we need to get it right. So I'm not going to elaborate on this slide too much. There are a couple of points I wanted to make before I started. One is that there's a lot of evidence now that shows us the economic and environmental and social values that trees can bring to new developments, and it's worth bearing that in mind when one is trying to sell the proposal to have trees, perhaps to a reluctant developer. And the other thing that's really important is that on average, about 30% of trees are on public land and 70% of trees are on private land. But if you look, this is the very front cover of the design guide code. Here are these trees, which are either on the garden of the house on the right or a garden further away, but look at the impact they're having on the quality of the development. So these trees on private land are really delivering public goods for everybody. And we need to think how to look after those and how to actually help, in fact, retain them. So trees and environment, where to begin? I started looking at the model design code and I tried to consider what I didn't think it was covering. And I was really concerned that I didn't see words like microclimate and microclimate-based design. And I don't know how many of you looked at new developments, but feel that how can the same sort of house be facing north, south, east, or west? I mean, is somebody claiming they want a north-facing living room, or is it actually a rather unconsidered approach to master planning? Where's the role of the trees in building performance? You know, we know that trees can shade, we know overheating is a huge problem. Where's that interface between trees and the actual environment, you know, the microclimate that they can create for people? Climate change, no mention of climate change. It's one of our big challenges. We've all got to get to net zero. Surely there's a role here. You know, Sue's told us about the problems of heavy rainfall events. We know we've got to increase urban cooling. We need trees for shading places for our children to play in some of these hot summers we've been experiencing. active travel needs to have shaded walkways, shaded cycleways. Children need shaded play space. We may even just want shade to sit outside. So where's that sort of concept covered? And then biodiversity net gain, and this is like to be a planning requirement. 10% I think should be an absolute minimum. But how can design help inform ways of achieving this? And also, how do we know what we've got at the outset? Is our base information sufficiently good to demonstrate that we are actually achieving net gain? So I felt those were omissions that should somehow be accommodated. What does the design guide say about trees? So here's our little diagram, and we've got some street trees with, as Sue said, all the sort of various elements that go with trees. I don't think the trees are actually integrated with the SuDS there though, and I think that's something we should take up. Page 30 says that all new streets should include trees, street trees. I'm not sure how realistic that is, but equally, it would be worth highlighting the benefits of having trees, their ability to store carbon, sequester carbon, remove pollution, help with rainfall interception, you know, all these kind of things. But equally, there's a little encouragement because I see a tree has been allowed to replace what might have been some car parking area. And maybe that's the beginning of sort of, you know, taking space for other uses than just cars. And I think it was in the design code that actually said, you know, how do we actually encourage less dependence on private cars? I did eventually, thanks to somebody on the call, find street trees extract C note N33. I didn't find it immediately, and somebody pointed it out to me. It didn't actually say very much about street trees and design principles, so I don't think we should count on that. Page 24, some issues of concern. It's sort of one of the problems when you show little diagrams without thinking necessarily what they're actually demonstrating. So if you go down to the secondary streets, you're starting to actually see some what we call street canyons. And there's one street here in the middle where they've actually got the canopies meeting, but there's a car underneath. And people who know about air quality will know there's a huge amount of concern about emissions from vehicles and trapping pollution. Did you hear?
Don't worry, go on.
It's still working?
Yeah, it's still working.
Okay, so all new streets should include trees on page 30. Whoops, that's slipped, hasn't it? So, however, help is at hand. If you go to TEDx Trees and Hard Landscapes, it will actually show you how to overcome some of these problems and actually find practical solutions. But there are other things in the guide, again, where the drawing has opened a question, but hasn't actually mentioned it as, hasn't seen it as a problem. So here we've got a tree on a street near a house. Well, what's the underlying geology? Is it a shrinkable soil? What's the dangers of subsidence? All new dwellings on low-rise buildings on shrinkable soils should have resilient foundations that can accommodate trees and reduce the use of concrete, of course. But this means that building regs approved document A needs to be updated. NHBC chapter 4.2 needs to be revised. Insurance companies need to stop asking you in the small print whether you've got a tree within X meters of your house. So it's no use showing a little diagram about what could be done when actually underneath that is a whole series of things that need to happen if it is to be done. And shockingly, there was no mention of all the Trees and Design Action Group work, which I'm going to actually highlight because so many of you are members and a lot of you volunteer your time to help produce these guides, and they really do answer a lot of the questions that the model design code failed. Encouraging images, page 31. So when people are talking about street trees, let's get out of our minds the idea that you have to have serried ranks of pairs of trees just marching along the street. I mean, there are many, many ways in which you can integrate and introduce trees into streets without having to simply line them with trees. You can do alternate planning. You can do highlight crossing places. You can make landmark links. I mean, it's not just let's get out of our minds that we're just going to have rows of trees in streets. And when you come to look at designing with trees, you've got to ask yourself some real questions. What are you trying to do here? What's the purpose of planting the trees? What's the brief? What are the benefits you're trying to achieve? Where's it going? That will influence the way in which you plant them. If they're in a very hard urban landscape, you will have to plant them very differently to if they're in a grass verge with adjacent open, front gardens, which give more opportunities for tree roots. Will the trees be adopted? If they're in streets, are highway authorities going to adopt them? There's a resistance to do that, but that's why we have to bring the highway authorities along with others. What's the long-term management and maintenance plan? And what's the level of investment? Do we understand the level of investment needed? Because when we talk about planting trees, we actually need to mean planting plus 5 or 10 years until the tree is established as being independent in the landscape as part of that initial capital expenditure and investment. How can planning support tree planting? The England tree strategy must be enshrined in law. At one point a couple of years ago, we nearly achieved that, but number 10 pushed us back apparently. All local authorities must have tree strategies, and they must be embedded in their local plans and be legally binding. And tree strategies must not be confused with green infrastructure strategies or be a subset of them. Trees are very long-lived, they're often transgenerational. Green infrastructure actually can come and go. The green roof on a building is there for the life of the building. While we're trying to save buildings as much as we can't always guarantee that they'll be there. Retaining existing trees must be a first priority. Existing trees bring huge values to development sites, so there should be real effort in design to ensure that existing trees are retained. And similarly, because those sites are benefiting from the trees that already exist that some previous generation planted, we've got to be bold and generous and plant them in our time for future generations. Tree replacement policy must be included in a tree strategy. And please understand, it is not take out a tree, plant a tree. If you take away, say, a 60-year-old beech tree to deliver the same services and amenity value, you probably need to plant 7 Norway maples. I don't use that because it's my tree of choice. It just happens to be the one we had figures for against the ecosystem services delivered. And local authorities for their public estates must have tree management plans. So what would I like to see in this model design guide? I'd like to see the ambition if we're going to be talking about trees for all the things they can do for us. I really would like to see the whole ambition kind of raised. And I think people have covered those things, but I think there's so many things that could be done for trees that actually benefit placemaking, that we really need to work out how to effectively design with trees and ensure they deliver the benefits they can. And I think that's enough about trees.
Thank you, Sue. I don't think we can, it's never enough about trees. They're so important and crucial for our environments. And, you've highlighted the very important point again that came up in our first event as well, that it's not just the code, it's all the other regulations, down to the mortgage applications that need to kind of follow suit really, so we can actually deliver the vision and the objectives set out. So now we come to the community aspect. So Martina Juvara is going to give us the perspective from the community. Martina is specializing in strategic planning and urbanism, and really passionate about places, in particular about how people transform them and adapt them and live in them. So she will tell us about working with the community and highlighting some motivations and challenges from the eyes of the community. Over to you, Martina.
Thank you very much. Is my screen on? Can you all see my screen now?
Yeah, it's not on full screen yet. Oh, now it is. Yes.
Coming now. Okay, I have a very short presentation, but takes the angle and the perspective of the community and the role that communities have, or that they will have, in establishing the quality of design, the concept of beauty, and of course, that in the context also of future planning. Particularly, this is important for the design codes, because there has been a lot of discussion whether the move in the planning white paper, but also potentially with this model design code, to go away from what it is accessible to the community and become more and more technocratic, and therefore disempower communities in participating and contributing effectively to decision making. Now, my own perspective, of course, I'm a professional, therefore I'm not the voice of the community directly, but I have, I try to portray what my experience is of 5 to 6 years of work directly with local bodies and communities when they are the client. Is a range there. I have a list of projects. It's not necessarily important, the projects. It's just that in every case, their reason for intervening in the planning system was different. They had different aspirations. They wanted to achieve different things. And for them, planning is the tool, is not the end in itself, is the tool that can be used to influence what they need to influence, or they feel that they need to influence. And it can range in very different situations, from large greenfield developments like the one in the Gilston area, to urban location like in Lewisham. I just want to highlight one particular issue, that is that of funding, and one particular experience that was that of the preparation of village design guides, not codes, but guides, near Cambridge and for the area around Cambridge. The project was led and managed and funded through the district council, South Cambridgeshire District Council. But it was organized in a way that the community, the local communities, were really the clients. So although they were not commissioning the project directly, they were really the agents and the decision makers. And that, I thought, that was a very good model that produced 8 different village design guides with very specific to the context of the place. You will see there on the lighter blue a comment from one of the villages I worked with, without many of the complications that come with community working. Why communities deserve to be partners in the development process, and really the word key here is partners. Well, they really understand the place like nobody else does. If we are talking about quality of place, if we are talking about context, we cannot do that without talking to the community that know why a village is very different from the village next to it. What makes every place unique and special. It would be like going to Italy and refusing to ask the Italians where to find a good restaurant, and then complaining why the restaurants are not so good. That would be absurd, and I don't understand why this relationship is not embedded a lot more clearly. And also, although there is the neighborhood plans allow agency and allow the community to promote their views of a development area, the design codes don't do that to the same extent. And we just completed the examination, recommended for referendum, the Gilston area neighborhood plan. You see the cover there. It's a neighborhood plan prepared by a community of 800 people, roughly, for a greenfield development of 10,000 homes. So really a huge difference in scale, but it has been the proof that constructive work really has all-round benefits. It provides a much clearer understanding of what the place is about for the decision maker, for the planners, decision makers, and also helps the developers to understand how they have to interact with the place in the course of the development. So that is the proof that that happens, and that there is a definite role that communities have to have. What annoys communities? Well, several things, but in the context of today and design and the preparation of design codes is really a few things that I have highlighted here. One is that of Disney design. A design that targets what outsiders perceive as a local vernacular. Just to tell an anecdote, a friend of mine decided to move from London to the Cambridge area. She knew I was working on the design guides there. And so she told me this story that she bought this house, beautiful house. For her was the epitome of the local, of what a local house in Cambridgeshire should be. And after a year living there and making friends with the community, she realized that her development was considered ghastly by the majority of the people that lived there for a long time. She had the good humor to laugh about it, but she realized that she didn't really understand what local, a good local context was when she was just shopping around for a development. So if it is true what Tony was saying earlier, that the value of a place is only what people are prepared to pay for, well, we are not testing that necessarily. We maybe design targeting what the buyers would perceive as being correct, rather than what the place actually is about. And therefore, this sort of is a short-termism that we possibly should avoid doing. Another thing that is infuriating, and I lived that, and then there's another anecdote that I would like to bring up that I lived through, is that of patronizing developers or technical people, designers or architects or technical engineers. I was in Gilston. I was sitting one day in a public consultation event next to the director of the transport consultancy that was working on the development. Of course, I was introduced, but he had not probably listened. And when I questioned some of his proposals and choices, he just simply said, oh, but this is a technical choice. It's too difficult for you to understand. So there is no point in me explaining it to you. Now, if this is what happens to normal community members, of course, it is completely unacceptable. It is not the way of working. Another thing that is important to mention at this stage is that of this urban design dogma. In the same way that we urban designers complain that DB32 became the norm and traffic engineers design roads in the same way without any consideration of context, we also run the risk with a design code, and particularly with the national design code, like the one we have in front of us, that we impose an urban design dogma that is replacing the understanding of context. For example, corner gateways, perimeter blocks, etc., that really don't have any place in rural context, but because they were in the urban design compendium 10 years ago, 15 years ago, they're applied over and over and over again, no matter what the situation. And that is a risk that we are running, and we have to be very careful of. And without the discussion with the community, it's really difficult to understand. Now, here in this picture, in this set of pictures, are all photographs of schemes that were identified in the community when we were working on the Cambridge design guides as completely unacceptable developments. Some of these have won prizes. Some of these have won awards in the context in which they are, but they're not necessarily models that are universal, that should be replicated everywhere. And therefore, we have to be very, very careful as designers, and particularly through the implementation of the design codes, not to replicate these mistakes and really be very specific about the context. What communities need to be effective partners? I really think, from my experience of the past few years, really a few very important things. One is respect and the recognition that they are partners in the development. And that is not for example, has not been recognized particularly well, in my view, in this new pilot. For example, the pilot for the design codes, parishes and town councils are not eligible to apply to prepare a pilot. And why not? They are. It would have been interesting to do that. Also, they need agency, not the binary role that they have now of being consulted or being engaged, and then they can only approve or object to a development. They have really to be involved throughout and have the potential to be involved throughout. The neighborhood plan is a good model because it gives the communities the opportunity to take the lead. But of course, not necessarily is adequately supported or adequately funded. And so that is the other 2 points. The technical support is necessary to translate what communities have to say in a non-technical way and turn it into something that is fit to become guidance, and particularly in the context of design codes, guidance that is binding, that is strict. And then, of course, adequate funding. Development is worth billions, and then communities receive absolutely no funding or very little funding to be able to influence that appropriately. So just now I have a 90-second snapshot from a video that was prepared for the neighborhood plan, for the Gilstone area neighborhood plan, that highlights, in the words of the community, the reason why they got involved, the technical challenges, the financial issues in the face of huge investment, really the David and Goliath aspect of participating in planning, and then the thin line of working with developers and the council and not being sort of like collaborating, not trying to facilitate the development, but really trying to keep to hold developers to account. And so this hopefully works. And that is the end of my...
It's not that we want the developments, but if it's going to happen, we want it to happen in a good way and in a pragmatic way, which is why we've got the neighbourhood plan. So the promises the developers made at the outset get properly recorded and implemented.
You start these neighbourhood plans, you know nothing about it unless you're a planner, which nobody is. You haven't a clue what is needed, and it's all very technical and it's massive. What it is you're actually trying to achieve. And on top of that, obviously, we were in the face of 10,000 houses in our rural area. And it used up £5,000, which was over our budget by this stage. And that's a considerable amount of money for a voluntary group. I mean, we basically funded the whole plan on £25,000, and then this came in. Most of our money came from locality, central government funding, and the rest was supplemented by the local parishes.
What we did was talk to the developers, were talking to the council about the development itself, and we tread quite a thin line in terms of our residents. But we seem to have kept our neighbours on board. Yeah.
So that is it, and that's that perspective.
Thank you very much, Martina. I think a number of really important points were raised, and I think the kind of bringing it to the design code is, can a national model design code actually maybe potentially help as well understand communities around some of the design issues, or does it hinder? So I think there's a kind of further discussion there of how to kind of relate the national model design code to those communities, because codes often are quite technical and difficult to understand. So now to our last but not least, to Rob Cowan. Rob will talk about skills, resources, and kind of planning and urban design. And I mean, you know, you all know him. I don't need to introduce him. Long-standing member and former director of the UDG, a writer, cartoonist, campaigner. And I think very frequently brings a smile to all of our faces with its brilliant cartoons. And I hope you will share some today. Over to you, Rob.
Thank you, Katja. I'll be very quick because we're running a bit late. I'll see if I can do this in 5 minutes. We have the first slide. And the first thing to say is that, you know, I'm confused because, you know, the question is where are the skills going to come from? And some of the skills are specifically to do with design coding, and some of them are urban design skills, and a lot of the skills for design coding are generic urban design skills that there's a great shortage of. So, you know, we will have to upskill to present those. Next slide, please. And I find it very confusing that the government at the same time is talking about design coding and specifying what places should look like and how they should work. And at the same time, it's talking about deregulation for planning. So how does that work? Is it serious about design coding, or are there certain places where design coding is appropriate and others not? And what does design coding mean anyway? Next slide, please. Because actually, there isn't a specific definition of what a design code is. The term is used to cover a whole range of different things, and design codes and design guides, in some way the terms are interchangeable, and there's no problem with that, because generally in urban design it doesn't work trying to define things like master plan. We know that the term isn't very specific. All sorts of things are called master plans, and that doesn't matter as long as we talk about what we're actually doing at a particular time. And I find it useful to think about design codes that they're trying to do two things, or if we're describing, first of all, we need to say, well, what are we doing? And two things we can define is, well, how prescriptive is this thing going to be? And if it's highly prescriptive, then, you know, maybe we call it a design code. If it's advisory, maybe it's a design guide. Again, what scale is it being related to? The scale of a plot. A lot of design codes relate to fairly small scales, or defining things on plots. Other design codes relate to areas, and the government is talking about design codes as relating to the whole towns, the whole local authority areas. And all these things are possible, but we need to know what we're doing. And the other dimension not shown on this graph is really the amount of local distinctiveness. So, for example, you can say all streets should have trees, and that can be a national policy. You could say that's a design code policy. It's not local distinctive, it's a national standard. And you can have national standard design codes, or we can have design codes or design guides that are locally distinctive. So we need to think about the scale, the prescriptiveness, and the degree of local distinction. And if we sort all those things out, then we'll know what it is we're talking about. But we shouldn't assume that because we're saying we're going to do a design code, that tells us what it's going to be. Next slide, please. So we need skills, and some of these skills we have, and some we'll need more of if we're going to do a lot of more coding. And some of these things are generic urban design skills. And I use this diagram in thinking about what skills you might need for producing a design code, and also for for planning the process of design coding. And that is, we need, if we're going to produce a design code, we don't just decide we're going to have a code. What we need to do is design the process and how it's going to work. So we decide the code, and then we design the code. And designing a code is a particular complex skill. Appraising the local context, an enormous part of urban design, but that's incredibly important, and it can be difficult to do. It can take a lot of resources. Applying policy and guidance, taking account of other regulatory regimes. We think about designing a code that is going to be shaping development, but of course there's a million things that shape development. A lot of them are actually codes or regulations or ways of working or professional practices. And unless we understand what these things are and how they affect what we're going to design, we won't be able to design a design code that does a few things effectively. And then we need to test the code. Once we've produced it, does it work? Will it prevent bad design? Will it enable good design? Then we need to adopt it. We need to use it. How do you use a design code? What does it mean to use a design code? Well, we need to understand that. And then in using it, do we do design review of development proposals in the light of the code? And how does that work? And do the people who are doing the design code understand how that works? And then things change. We need to monitor and enforce the code. Is it enforceable? How do you enforce a design code? What does that mean? And we need to review it and revise it if it's going to continue in use, if the development is continuing. And the other things on the right, still relating to designing the code, applying the necessary skills and resources. Do we have those? Where are they going to come from? Engaging with stakeholders and the public. Generally, producing a design code isn't just somebody sitting down and writing a code or adopting a standard code, but working with stakeholders and saying, what's important about this place? What do we really want to put down on paper and agree that's going to shape this development? Well, again, there's a completely different set of skills to run that sort of process. We've heard several people already talking about understanding what will be viable. The code needs to be based on economics and understanding development economics, and deciding what elements will be mandatory or discretionary, and they all go into the code. So there's the challenge. That's the process that we now need to try and make work, and I'll end it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rob. Wow, that was like 7 really amazing presentations, lots of information. I mean, I've just been trying to look through this chat as well, and it's pages and pages of really good comments and discussion. I know we have overrun a little bit, but I would like to almost give the word back to each of the speakers and maybe draw out one of particular words or subject for each of them, just to kind of bring some of your comments back into the discussion. Unfortunately, we won't have that much time for Q&A. Phil, can I start with you? And maybe a reflection of what you've heard. And we had a particular question around accessibility and inclusive design and how that is picked up in the National Model Design Code.
I need to, as I say, I haven't had time to look at it in great detail. So whether that how closely that is addressed, I would need to have a look. I mean, it certainly should be. I mean, it's at the heart of making places that can be accessed by a range of people, and all public bodies have the public sector equality duty. And I think higher authorities they're pretty attuned to that, but whether they do apply it as well as they should. So I would hope it doesn't need to be kind of over. There's always a question: is how much can you put in a document like this, and how much do you signpost to other documents? I mean, it's being faced in Manual for Streets as well. You know, you could write the Design Manual for Roads and Bridges is hundreds of pages. Do we need to recreate that for streets, or can we signpost to other documents? And the same with the National Model Design Code. How much do we kind of, you know, get a hierarchy of documents? I mean, I was struck by what Sue said about the fact that trees and hard landscaping isn't referenced. Perhaps that's maybe what we need to do is get a really good set of references into this. And I'm also, I mean, we some of the discussion that was criticising the code for being too urban. It is only a model. It is only setting out the things that can be considered. It's there as a fallback, as I understand it, it's there as a fallback position. If a local authority doesn't have the resources, and of course, you know, in the real world they may not, and desirably they should, but that's a broader question. It's only possible to do so much in a national document. So yeah, how far can it go to address every last little thing, as important as they are? It's a difficult question.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think we've heard today again how complex it is with all the different aspects. So signposting to maybe more technical guidance or other elements is absolutely essential. Helen, if I can come back to you next. I mean, yeah, general reflections, and could you say something about how the code might actually also relate to the ever increasing I guess, scope of permitted developments? And, you know, soon do we actually need a code? I mean, a lot of things are being addressed through other.
Yeah. Well, with permitted development, I guess a code could be used as a form of prior approval to make sure that the permitted development doesn't have any negative impacts, you know, and fits in with the local context. So yeah, I understand how it could work in terms of that regime. But I think for me, I think it is important, as the planner would say, to be clear about terms and what we mean by terms. So I spent a lot of my time over the last 10 years getting everyone on the same page with what do we mean by a master plan? What do we mean by that? And then making sure that we can embed master planning in the planning system, in the local plan process. Because in my experience, I see it feels like master plans are going out of favour now because their name's not being mentioned very much, but actually out there in terms of what we're all doing, there's lots and lots and lots of master plans being produced. The issue is, how do they get implemented? You know, they're very good in terms of design instruction if they've been done properly, if they've been done on a good evidence base, if they've been done in consultation with the community, you know, all the right things, but they're not the end of the story. As I tried to sort of explain in my presentation, they fix design instruction at one stage, and to me a design code is then needed, you know, to sort of direct the actual implementation of the master plan. And I think for me, I don't quite understand how a code could be sort of worked up and implemented without a master plan, without a vision, a sort of site-specific spatial framework. But the two to me go hand in hand. And I think from a planning perspective, I'd be a bit worried that codes would just sort of develop with the community in almost quite a conceptual way. You know, like, oh, what do we like to see? How many stories? What's the building line? What setbacks would we like? What materials would you like to see? And everybody agrees a code, you know, in a regulating plan, but actually that can't be implemented because it wasn't developed on, you know, a credible technical evidence base in terms of site constraints, etc. So I think it's important for codes to be robust, that they need to have some depth of analysis beyond a character appraisal. So that's one of my key points. And obviously I made the point about, I do think the code is weak on green infrastructure. And you know, in terms of green infrastructure, there isn't even a guide to go to like Manual for Streets. There's nothing to go to for a planner, a designer. I understand green infrastructure standards are being worked up by the government, but, you know, is that another metric? You know, we kind of need advice, don't we, on how to plan and design properly for green infrastructure and integrate all these things, which for me personally, I think are just as important as streets.
Okay, thank you very much. Tony, what are your reflections? I mean, I was looking through the chat, and I mean, you made a very relevant point that design quality sells. somebody in the chat said, well, unfortunately, bad design sells as well. And can the code help there or not? And what are your other reflections?
I'd like to pick up the point which Rob was addressing, and also which Helen was addressing, relating to what's the status of these design codes, design guides, design policies, because these are going to get tested. They're going to get tested on appeal, but they're also going to get tested throughout the economic cycle. And it's interesting that when you go around some very large development schemes, that you can actually detect at what point the cycle turned down, because the quality of the detailing and the quality of the schemes actually began to get a bit thinner. So this question of enforcement of these codes and what their status is, I think will arise, but I'm putting it in a cyclical economic context from my background, rather than that's something that urban designers should be fully preoccupied with. But economic cycles are a reality, and when that reality comes, you know, somebody is going to have to take a decision whether or not to relax the code to facilitate something or other. Does there need to be a mechanism for that? At what point is delivery of actual, in the government's terms, dwelling units superior to qualitative delivery? So you can have 100 units at this standard or 75 at this standard. These are, you know, very hard choices that are going to be made, but it will come back to what is the status of these codes, guides, and policies, because they will be challenged legally.
Yeah, very good questions. And I think we haven't quite got the answer to that, I think, at this point, but it will be very interesting to see when decisions are made and appeals come in of how robust these documents are. Sue, any reflections? Sue Illman, sorry, there are two Sues on the call. Oh, you're muted.
I think in a way, just surprised and delighted to see the response for people understanding this need for, you know, interprofessional collaboration, and also, you know, the landscape-led approach. 10 years ago, that would have been unheard of. So what that says is, you know, we are changing. We do understand the need to work together. Clearly, it's not as, you know, it's not as pervasive as it should be. And I think, you know, egos mustn't get in the way. We all have our role to play, and we all have our role to play in design and development at different stages and to a different extent. And I think it's about professional respect and actually having a vision about what you're trying to achieve. And I think, you know, moving forward in that way is brilliant, and that's, you know, exactly how it should be. I think with regards SuDS and the code, I think my feeling is that there are certain things, and this is one of them, where it's an overarching issue. I don't think it can and should be pocketed into something like nature. Clearly, the relationship with nature is an important one, and we can support each other really well, but it's about a much, much bigger picture. So that would be, I think, the thing I would wish to communicate most. Thank you, Sue. And you mentioned the word vision, and I think that personally, I think is something that is just a shortcoming of the National Model Design Code, because it's only kind of mentioned fairly briefly. And I think without a vision, you can't code. I mean, you have to know what you're going to code for. And I think that is an absolutely essential step. And I think that could be given more importance. Okay, then next, Sue James.
Okay, go ahead. Any questions that rose?
Well, I mean, there are lots and lots of comments. I mean, there's one question, lots of debate. One really direct question. Should all trees over a certain age be automatically TPO'd?
All trees should be TPO'd, and then you argue about taking them away.
I expected you to
However, what I reflected on as I listened to everything and everybody and read the chat and so on is that, and I did make a point about it, here we are in the 21st century, we've had over 100 people in this room. The embodied knowledge and understanding in this room is phenomenal, and a lot of it's been around for a long time. So it's sort of shocking that we're still having to discuss what we're having to discuss. I really think we should have it in place. And there's a kind of tremendous fear of red tape. I think we need to start coming in praise of a bit of red tape, because red tape can give a level playing field, tell people what they've got to do, and then, you know, people can get on and do it and stop arguing about viability and all these other things, because that's what actually has to happen. That reflects land values and so on and so forth. And I do think, of course, we need to engage with communities, but with a lot of new developments, we haven't got the community. So come on, we have to take our design responsibilities, our professional responsibilities, to actually start designing places that are actually going to work for people and all the other factors that they have to do. And also my last point was there's an interconnectedness of all things. So as Sue said, we can't parcel things up. We need the diagram. We were trying to do one today on trees, you know, just all the things that actually sort of influence each other and need to be thought of at the same time. And it's sort of complex, but it doesn't have to be complex. It can actually be quite straightforward if we just, you know, allow ourselves to think in that mode. So that's me.
Thank you very much, Sue. And Martina, any reflections?
I just would like to echo what Helen said earlier. How a code without a master plan, a code without a vision, that I'm really particularly referring to the planning white paper, you know, the identifying a growth area and then just jumping into a code. And if the code reflects the structure of the model, the national model code, it will end up, unfortunately, with either a focus on detail and what, you know, what kind of brick color we like, or, you know, and things that are not important, are not matter of principle, and they're not matter of structure, or become uniform, what I called either, you know, the urban design dogma, you know, this every place looking the same. And within this context, communities, I'm just, you know, trying to focus on the angle I took. For communities, it will be impossible to work within that structure, just because either there is not sufficient guidance to either stop jumping to details and to focus instead on a principle and structure when there is no master plan. And so there should be a series of national model design codes for the various stages, and particularly considering all of how all of these elements come together and all of the partners of development come together. If we consider that development and city building and cities are public goods, they're there forever, we cannot accept that it's just a matter for a technical team and the bankers. We cannot accept that. That would be defeating what planning is about. So,
okay. Thank you, Martina. Thanks a lot for that. Rob, any final words?
Just one quick thing, the question of, you know, what happens if we don't have the skills to produce these codes, which certainly at the moment we don't. And what I fear is that then the answer will be given standard solutions and told, well, here's a design code and it says every street should have trees in it and a few other things totally unrelated to the context or the people who live there. And that the design codes will become standard design codes, which are related in very little way to what we consider as good urban design.
Thank you, Rob. And I mean, that's funding, resources, skills came up a number of times in the chat, and I'm sure that is something that certainly the UDG will feed back in our response. Well, I think, thank you very much. Thank you for this. I mean, the speaker, fantastic presentation. Thank you for the a full room. I mean, it's not a room. I can only see a few of you at a time anyway. But I mean, thank you for attending, and thanks for putting all your comments, ideas, thoughts into the chat. We will download it, and I have no idea how, but somehow we will distill all the comments we had in these two events and create a response to the consultation, which will go onto the website, and hopefully you will see your comments reflected in that. So have a lovely evening, and thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks, Katja.
Thank you. Goodbye.